was completely unaware that this beautiful slice of history ever took place. Did you know that Harry Belafonte took over The Tonight Show? And why do you think such an important event was forgotten over time?
So I did not know it until a couple of years ago. I'm walking down the hallway at 30 Rockefeller Plaza with my friend, Joan Walsh, who I've been friends with for, at that point, maybe a dozen years or more, because she was the first person who actually wrote for when she was an editor at a magazine many years ago online. And so we were friends. We were just walking down the hall, and she was writing a piece to commemorate Mr. B's birthday, and it was about this week. And she told me about the piece. She sent me a copy of it. And I said to her, this is a piece of history I had never heard before. And this should be a movie. This should be a documentary, because I doubt many people know this. And, I'm somebody who's a fan of Harry Belafonte. I've seen many of his films. My mother was in love with him. And I never knew this. So I think this is one of those stories. It's one of those hidden figures type stories, right? Where you should know, I guess. But no, I had no idea.
Okay, now I don't feel so bad. This is incredible. But why do you feel this documentary and somewhat undisclosed footage needed to be shared?
So, I think it's important to show it. And just to give you a little bit more of the backstory, when I said this to Joan, we wound up getting with our friend, Valerie Thomas, who is one of the producers and writers on the film, and started, getting the ball rolling, doing the interviews, meeting Mr. Belafonte and getting him to do the interview, and then bringing on Yoruba, who's the director of the film. And I think it's important that this be done because, history can either be elucidating and illuminating or be a wormhole. And because we've forgotten in this country and because we don't tell a lot of our history, particularly our Black history, it's one of the reasons that we have such a hard time advancing as a culture and as a multicultural community, because we just don't know. We keep relearning the same lessons over and over again because we keep forgetting that we did learn it before. And one of the things that Harry Belafonte accomplished during this week is, number one, he integrated late night, right? Because the late night space is so white. It's so, non-diverse, and still is, unfortunately, other than The Daily Show, that, nobody had ever seen a Black man in that space, in that powerful show. The most powerful show, arguably, on television was The Tonight Show. Probably the most influential man in the country, other than Walter Cronkite, was the Tonight Show host, right? And for him to hand over the reins of this show to a Black man, to a Black celebrity, it was incredibly important. And it was an opportunity for Harry Belafonte to teach people through the guests that he had, through the conversations he had, for people to see another side of Dr. King. Because remember, Dr. King was Harry Belafonte's friend. So he's able to interview him as a friend and not just as an admirer from a distance or as a journalist. He was able to interview Robert Kennedy Jr., both of these two men, months before they died. And so I think it was important for Johnny Carson to make that move because he ceded some of his space and some of his power to a Black man. But also, I think it was important for Harry Belafonte to be able to tell the stories of Black people through these interviews directly to the American public.
And you yourself, you have years of experience as a host and correspondent. So what does an opportunity like this, given this platform, to be the first Black man to take over such an enormous platform, what does an opportunity like that mean for a host?
It means a lot. I mean, I can remember the first time, that I sat in, for Chris Matthews on Hardball, or sat in for Rachel Maddow. Maybe the most intimidating one I ever did was sitting in for Rachel Maddow, because that show is so huge. You sit there and you think, okay, it's like house sitting. You just don't want to break the furniture and leave the place messy, right? You're like, I need to make sure that I do a good job here and that I don't mess up this incredible franchise. And so it can be very difficult filling in for a host. And I filled in for pretty much all of the primetime hosts on MSNBC. And it's always a different and unique experience. All the cultures are different. A show has a culture. A show is it's like a little community. And so you're moving in, you're kind of like the step parent, moving in. And so I think think it's number one, an opportunity because there's an existing audience there. They know what they like, they know what they expect, and you're being exposed to that audience, and they're getting a chance to see you and maybe then listen to you. Maybe listen to you after that show is over. And so you're creating an influence, an opportunity for influence. And for a Black person in 1968 to have the opportunity to have that broad national influence over a white audience is revolutionary. And it was truly revolutionary because of the guests and because of the interviews that Mr. Belafonte chose to do. He could have kept it light. He could have kept it entertaining. He could have kept it song and dance, because that's what the public kind of knew of him, that he was this glamorous, beautiful entertainer. But he kept it real instead. And he made people think, and he forced people to confront some things about race that they were definitely not used to hearing in late night.
So unfortunately, the racial climate of today is kind of similar to how it was in 1968. So if you were given this opportunity to take over the Tonight Show now for a week during this time, what guests would you have on the show, and what would you like to address?
Well, that is a really great question. I definitely would, I'd go ahead and make the ask for the Obamas. I would say I need to have both of the Obamas. I would definitely want to have Senator Kamala Harris, because of course, let's say we're doing it this week. She could be the next vice president of the United States. I would definitely bring on Bishop William Barber. I think William Barber, in this time is one of those important figures who is moving the country forward in a deeply moral way, and making these strong moral arguments in a lot of the ways that Dr. King did. I would definitely have on my big brother, Reverend Al Sharpton, because he doesn't play games. He keeps it straight, no chaser. He is an activist from the old school who was trained under Dr. King. He was a little kid, so he wasn't at the age of the King, Dr. King, but he was younger than Jesse Jackson, and was really the activist that I encountered and admired when I moved back to New York as a teenager. So I think that he should be there. I would have on the women who created Black Lives Matter. I think that these sisters have changed the world, and a lot of people don't realize that it was Black women who created Black Lives Matter. And Brittany Packnett Cunningham, Alicia Garza, these are some of the smartest women in the country, and I think it's important to have them be a part of that conversation. I would have on Nicole Hannah-Jones, whose 1619 project has forced people to really reckon with our history in a way that is very uncomfortable for a lot of people, but that is extremely necessary. So those are the kind of guests that I would invite on.
I want to tune into that show. I'm really ready. That sounded great. I like the lineup. But the sit-in provides so much insight into that famous week, but also provides information about Harry Belafonte that people today might not know. So was there something new or interesting that you learned about Harry Belafonte that you didn't know prior to working on this documentary?
That's a really good question. I mean, I felt like I knew what kind of an activist he was, and and how empathetic he was. But I didn't realize he was such a good journalist. Right? I mean, he actually was quite good at doing the job that I do. He really could have been, a host in sort of a news space. He actually had a really great depth as an interviewer that I think a lot of people will be surprised by, and that I was surprised by, pleasantly surprised.
What do you want viewers to take away from this documentary? At this time, some people will say the industry is oversaturated now with stories, sharing Black stories. And I just want to know, what is your perspective? What are you hoping the message is from this?
Well, I would say the industry is not oversaturated with telling Black stories, because we have not told enough Black stories in all of the history of television in Hollywood. We've barely ever told Black stories that weren't about slavery. And we need to do stories about slavery, because most people don't understand it. They think it was people singing in the fields. They don't understand it was brutal and savage. So that's, to put a pin in that. But we're just beginning to scratch the surface of the story of the Black man and woman in America. And if people are uncomfortable with that, I'm sorry, but this is an increasingly multicultural world. You're going to start to hear more stories about all of the communities that are considered temporarily minorities, because we're becoming a majority minority country. So you're going to hear more Black stories, more brown stories, more AAPI stories, more LGBT stories, more trans stories, more of all these different stories that you don't get. And so people shouldn't start to get tired and exhausted, because this is only the beginning. And I think it's so important. And what I want people to take away, from seeing the sit-in, is that we're still in the struggle, that these things are not ancient history, that the struggles that we saw in the 1960s are current. They're current events. The same brutalities, the same hatreds, the same racism, the same lack, the same struggle continues, literally. And so I think what we should take from it is that we move forward. History is a wheel. It's always turning. It's slowly moving forward. But unfortunately, as it's turning, sometimes it's going back where it started. So in order for us to keep moving forward, we have to really thoroughly learn our past. And I think that's the big takeaway for me.
I was pleasantly surprised to learn about this documentary and slightly ashamed that I never knew this piece of history existed. Harry Belafonte was the first Black man to host a late night talk show for a week, and it's almost like it didn't happen. So when were you approached to direct this film, and what was the process of figuring out what you're going to do with this somewhat unknown information?
Well, that's a big question, the latter part of that question. So I was approached by the producers of the film in, I guess it's now the fall of 2019. And they had been developing this article written by Joan Walsh about the week. Joan Walsh, who's a correspondent for The Nation, and they've been developing it into a documentary. They had the vision to know that this could be a great documentary, even though so much of the footage was lost, so much of the tapes were lost. So they began looking for a director. And when I met with them, and they told me what the film was, I was immediately intrigued, because I too did not know about this week. And I thought I was pretty, up on my African-American history and entertainment history, especially. But it immediately appealed to me because I didn't know about it. So I'm always interested in subjects that are, unexplored, and that we haven't seen before. So it was, when the team decided that we all wanted to work together, it was a no-brainer for me. In terms of what to do and how to present the information, that's always the biggest challenge, right, with every film. We knew that obviously we were working at a deficit because we did not have so much of the footage, but we knew what we did have. And we knew we had these great interviews with Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. And that we were going to fill in the other guests by looking at their other archival footage of these guests. And there's so much great archival footage of some of these guests, like Lena Horne and Nina Simone, and Nina Simone, Lena Horne and Diane Carroll, Paul Newman, all of these other amazing guests, Buffy St. Marie. So we knew that we were going to, be looking for archival footage of these other guests, and that some guests were still with us. And we were able to do the interviews with Buffy St. Marie, and Petula Clark, and Dionne Warwick, and a few others who are still with us. So that was very important to have those voices. And then, of course, people who were influenced by Harry Belafonte, who did know about the week, or who, were friends and could give us insight into Harry's life, into his relationships with these guests. Because that's really, why they came on, is because of his relationships with them, and his deep knowledge, or his deep tentacles in both the political and entertainment industry. And then we also had, there had been a documentary about Harry Belafonte in, I think, 2010 that Suzanne Rostock did, the director. And she was really helpful in working with us to help us identify footage, to, you know, of the home movies, to help us navigate, you know, some of the archival world as well. So once we had all those elements, and then of course we had this, you know, probably about midway, we found that there was audio of the week, which was incredible to find. And so we were able to incorporate that. And then it was really about figuring out, you know, of course, how to put the scenes and the footage and the archival and the music together. But also what we began to realize is that, yes, it's about this week, but it's also about how Harry saw the world in 1968 and his relationships with these people who were very prominent in the world, and during this divisive time of 1968, where, you know, everything was exploding. Kind of similar to today.
Yeah, yes, unfortunately, it's very similar to today. But on top of interviewing the guests that actually were guests on the show during the week, the documentary also has several recognizable celebrities featured, including Whoopi Goldberg, Questlove, Tamron Hall, and there's several others. So how were they chosen, and why did you decide these people to speak on this week?
Well, Whoopi Goldberg, because she is friends with Harry, and also had a late night show herself, and also a talk show. And in fact, that's actually how we were looking at who has talk shows or late night shows today. So that's how we got Whoopi, and that's why we, you know, looked at Whoopi and reached out to her and to Tamron. And they also are friends, you know him. And then with Questlove, we thought he could be interesting because he is the Tonight Show band leader currently. And he is obviously an incredible, you know, thoughtful person who thinks about Black, African-American entertainment, et cetera. So that's why we reached out to those folks.
Who do you feel could be the Harry Belafonte of today?
Oh.
You know, someone that could take over this large platform like The Tonight Show and use it as a tool to bring people together, especially during this really divided time.
Okay, so I've always, and she's in the film, but I've always loved Robin Thede. I think she's great, and super, super funny and super smart and super personable. Which, who else? Wait, because we did think about this, and we were all emailing each other. Oh, this person would be great. This person would be great. And I'm trying to remember who else I thought could do it. I mean, these are all like sort of comedian people who do, like Issa Rae, I think, could do it.
So you're looking for like more in the woman's space, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Of course, we need to have a woman. Come on. Yeah. It still only has been, you know, men for the most part. So yes, I definitely think a woman for sure. And I know I have others because literally we emailed about this, but I'm just blanking out right now. It could be like rotating hosts, you know what I mean? So that you can get, I mean, that also could be the case too.
I would really like that. When I was speaking to Joy, I was thinking, let's do this. Let's give up the Tonight Show for a bit.
That's right. Yeah.
But the sit-in is a lesson in history and race relations in 1968. Also a lesson in Harry Belafonte, though. And I think his legacy has not been given the credit it deserves. So what was some surprising or interesting facts that you learned about Harry after working on this documentary?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like, I knew obviously who Harry Belafonte is, what his work in the, you know, at least, you know, his work in the movement, what an activist he is. But by making the film, I came to understand the depth of it, how how close he was to Martin Luther King, first of all. And that he was, one of the things I thought was fascinating, that he was a bridge between the more radical Stokely section of the movement that was emerging at that time and the more traditional civil rights movement. I thought that was fascinating. So that was one interesting thing. How he helped Robert Kennedy evolve on issues of race. That was fascinating to me. His global, which we weren't even able to get so much into the film, but his global appeal. And then not just like in the Caribbean where where he has roots, but all over the world, and his global perspective of what it means to be, a human, an artist, an activist.
Were you surprised by some of the guests? I was surprised to see Dr. King so casual, and normally we see him just so composed. So what were some of the guests that surprised you and you were happy to have that footage to see?
Yeah, well, if you watch the whole, yes, there's the Martin Luther King, which is amazing, and the ease in which he is on the couch talking with, Paul Newman and the others. It was amazing to see, actually to watch the whole Robert Kennedy interview as well, and to see how, how intimate it was. That was really great as well. And yeah, the other ones we don't really have the footage. We don't have the footage for. But Leon Bibb is another, I didn't know who he was. And now that I know who he is, he's actually come up in just my, sort of research that I've done on other projects. So it was great to see him, that we have him performing that song.
The films you have worked on have been predominantly surrounding themes of race. And other than being a Black woman, what attracts you to telling these stories? And do you think you'll branch out and do something completely different?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do. I definitely want to be able to have, experience making all different kinds of stories. But as we know, race is still the fundamental issue in this country. And there's still so many stories that haven't been told that I want to tell. So I keep, being drawn to these stories as an African-American woman, but also as a storyteller where we have, the fact that we're only now, telling the story, in the last, about so many different things, shows just how much further we have to go in terms of telling our stories and telling our stories correctly. We've also had a lot of misinterpretation of our stories and of our celebrities as well.
So Harry Belafonte taking over a week of The Tonight Show during an extremely divisive time is groundbreaking, but also shocking that this slice of history has not been celebrated more. You were very, very young when this happened, but do you remember any discussion surrounding this moment in time?
No, I wish I did. Not surrounding the show. And it's weird because my parents loved Harry Belafonte and they watched The Tonight Show every night. So, at some point in my 9-year-old psyche, maybe I could hear it from downstairs, with the TV on. But no, I had no memory of it. And honestly, it was kind of hiding in plain sight because Mr. B wrote about it in his memoir. And so I met him at the end of 2012, ironically, in the MSNBC green room. So, the circle is now closed.
Yeah.
And we had a great conversation, and I realized I wanted to know more about him. So I read his memoir, and there's a whole chapter there, where he describes a lot of it, of some of his guests, some of what went on, some of the controversy. And I just thought, I'm not a documentarian, I'm a writer, but I just was like, this is a documentary. Then I discovered there wasn't that much of the footage remaining, though we do have Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy. I don't know if you've been able to see it yet, but it's still very dramatic. And in the end, I decided, well, not in the end. At some point, I decided I'm just going to write about it. You know, I'm just going to interview people. I'm just going to try to recreate it in print. That's what I know how to do. And I did that. And that led me to my friend Joy Reid, who had me on her show and was like, "This is a documentary, sis." And I said, "Yeah, I know, but I don't know how to do that." And so we got together and, you know, made it work over time.
So although it's a great event in history to highlight and celebrate, do you also find it rather a bittersweet that the conversations from that week in 1968 still resonate today in 2020?
It's amazing to me. And especially, you know, it's always been relevant the whole time we've been making the film, but, you know, we finished up and we, you know, hooked up with Peacock right around the George Floyd protests, the beginning, you know, and so we're also in an election, you know, high stakes election year. So yeah, I guess I would have thought, and I know he thought that the world would be farther along. But I think we go in circles, and it's, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I don't know what the cliche is, but yeah, it's incredibly resonant right now.
And what do you think it was about Harry Belafonte that made him the man to fill these big shoes and take over this enormous platform?
I think it's hard to know from our vantage point right now exactly how big a star he was. You know, he won a Tony, an Emmy. He sold the first $1 million, million seller record. He was, you know, he was on the big screen, the little screen, on your Victrola, your whatever people call, you know, your record player back then. He was everywhere. And, you know, he also was very closely associated with Dr. King and the civil rights movement. So, you know, Norman Lear says to us in the film, really, there's no one but Harry who could have done this. And yet at the same time, it was a risk both for NBC and Johnny Carson and for Mr. B, because, you know, he didn't have any experience. And, you know, it doesn't necessarily come naturally to sit in the interviewer's chair and, you know, moderate 5 nights of discussion with a combination of, you know, funny entertainers and singers, but also heavy political conversations. So, you know, he talked to me about how he said no at first, and they really leaned on him, but he just was like, I don't have what Johnny has. But he had something very important and very, very different. And, you know, watching him and knowing that he was nervous it's just hard to believe, because he's so assured in that chair. And, you know, from everything we can see and talking to other guests, it just went incredibly smoothly.
I asked Yoruba, but I'm curious to know what you think as well. So this year, a few talk show hosts have had to take a break due to some racial issues that came to light, including Jimmy Kimmel and Ellen DeGeneres, and also the host of The Tonight Show, Jimmy Fallon. So who do you think would have been a great replacement to do like Harry and fill in the shoes of Jimmy Fallon?
You know, I'd love to see my friend Joy Reid get a week of the show. I think John Legend could do it, actually. That's a very good question. I mean, I'm sure there are other people, but when you think about somebody with that, you know, breadth of experience and familiarity with both politics and pop culture, you know, he immediately springs to mind.
You have been an ally and an activist and have held white people accountable for years now. You're not just hopping on board. So what initially sparked your passion for activism and actually speaking out?
You know, it really goes back to this time period, and growing up during the civil rights movement. Both my parents were really, really devout and active Catholics. And so, but they were the liberal Catholic social teaching kind of Catholics. So it was just, you know, the central struggle of our time growing up. And, you know, we watched the news, we saw what was happening, my parents, were both very upset with, I don't think I remember Selma. That would be pushing it. I've just seen so much of the, iconography, but, so much was being broadcast and brought to us as well. So I really think it goes that far back. I've never not cared about it. And, as a journalist, I've looked for stories that, illuminate the racial reality as best I can as a white woman. And I wrote the book, What's the Matter with White People? So, kind of an expert in that. But, I never thought we would really see what we've seen, that the backlash to a Black president would be so severe that it would give us this nightmare. Even I wasn't prepared for that. So cautiously optimistic about November, but, after 2016, none of us can really relax.
There are several films and documentaries and TV shows, especially being put out now, all trying to share a different perspective of the Black experience. What do you feel that the sit-in is trying, what message do you feel like the sit-in is trying to relay?
I think Harry Belafonte was committed to, as he puts it, showing Black life and Black excellence in all of its variety, but also showing that he had white allies. And so I think that's an interesting model. He didn't, he could have done an all only Black guest show. But, he'd rejected that earlier in his career. He came to a crossroads with a sponsor who didn't want him to have an integrated cast. So, I think he was trying to model a world where, we enjoy each other and come together as equals. And I think we still need to see that, and also I think representation really matters. And, late night remains too white. And I think that, people need to push and get in the door. And when they get in the door, bring other people with them. So, I think there's going to be a lot that's resonant. I hope young people see it. I really do. I know it'll be really nostalgic for older folks, but I think young people can get a lot out of it. So, that's one of my hopes.